What's up, guys? Just a little while ago, I took a trip to the UK. Now I'm back and more or less over my jet lag, at least enough to rub a couple brain cells together and organize my thoughts about the visit. Long story short, it was an amazing trip, and I came back inspired to try a lot of new things here at the Coral Farm. So, real quick, how did this trip even come to being? I wasn't planning on doing any more travel this year, but last minute, this got onto the schedule. I had Paul Hughes from Advanced Aquarium Consultancy on the podcast, and he invited me to be a panelist at an event that he was organizing in the UK called Coral Freaks. Normally, I duck speaking engagements like I'm Neo from The Matrix, but this was one of those deals that I could not say no to, and I am so glad that I went. I got to see a variety of different stores and tanks, but most importantly, I got to meet up with some amazing colleagues and hobbyists in Europe. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of the event itself because I was on stage the whole time. I will include some footage of the first Coral Freaks show back in 2019, the first time that I met Paul. It was a little different this time around in that it was a panel discussion format where Jeremy Gay from Reef Builders would lob us questions, and there was also an audience participation segment so they could do their Q&A. On the panel with me was Tony Vargas, Pat and Trina from Reef Wholesale in Canada, and Jamie Craggs from the Horniman Museum. I think the entire panel discussion will be up on YouTube by the time that this video gets done, so you can go check that out. Also, I should point out that the proceeds from this event went to a UK mental health charity called Mind. I happen to take mental health pretty seriously, and I'm always trying to craft a work environment here at Tidal Gardens that I actually want to spend time in. So I fully appreciate that Coral Freaks was supporting the cause. Outside of the event, I had some great conversations with industry folks, and I wanted to share some of those observations with you. Because, like I said, I came back rather inspired from this trip. First off, let's have a talk about these stores that I visited. AAC. My host for this visit was Advanced Aquarium Consultancy, which is considered one of, if not the best LFS in the UK. AAC is a very clean and organized shop. They have a main retail section with show tanks, dry goods, a large wall of quarantined fish, aquacultured coral, and wild imported coral. The really cool stuff is behind the scenes. They have some non retail spaces where they can do some experimental projects like breeding and coral farming. I enjoy seeing how other places do things. There's always little lessons you can pick up, especially when a store is doing things at a very high level. I have a few takeaways from seeing AAC. First thing, which will be a recurring topic of discussion, is their use of live rock. Prevailing sentiment with all of these places I visited in the UK is that there are overwhelming benefits to real deal live rock from a natural reef. The porosity of the rock, the microbiome, basically everything about it has positive effects on their systems, and they use a lot of it. I saw many sumps packed to the waterline with live rock as the main source of filtration. My worry with using live rock has always been the introduction of unwanted pests, but that does not seem to be a major concern here in the UK. The positives simply overwhelm those downsides. Having a stash of live rock in the sump could also help us with a problem that we've been having when we're swapping trays that happen to be too clean. We currently play this game where we want our trays clean enough that we don't get too thick a layer of coralline algae, but not so clean that it makes for a perfect surface to grow hair algae. Paul suggested conditioning the freshly cleaned trays in a dark sump filled with rock for about a week so that it can build up a light biofilm. When you then introduce that into the tanks, it's much less likely to explode into a forest of hair algae. Second thing is these little floating styrofoam boxes for mangroves. It's so simple, but it looks like it works really well. Mangroves are still not something that we mess around with a lot, but down the road, I could see starting a couple of mangroves in our peninsula show tank, and perhaps this is the perfect way to grow them and allow their roots to descend down into the rockscape. Third thing is the movement away from calcium reactors. Full disclosure, we love calcium reactors. We use them on every large system here at Tidal Gardens. They are not perfect, though. The media that's dissolved in a calcium reactor oftentimes can introduce phosphates and nitrates. We've always compensated for that with better nutrient extraction, but AAC in particular is going with direct dosing of cleaner additives instead of calcium reactors. Fourth observation has to do with their seahorse breeding program. Apparently, it's difficult to source seahorses in the UK, so they began breeding their own in this really nice ultra clean setup. I personally have never even kept seahorses in all my years in the hobby, but seeing this breeding setup, it's very cool. It's in the same room as this new coral farming setup that's just underway. By the way, it is not lost on me how more and more places are going with aluminum T-slot over the other alternatives out there. It's pricey stuff, but once you use it on one project, it's like you can never go back. Future spoiler, we're going to be redoing our greenhouse and going away from some of the old cinder blocks that we were using to aluminum T-slot eventually. Shout out to AluFab. Fifth and final thing is the show tanks. At this point in time, I am much more interested in system infrastructure and designing those types of things rather than show tanks. I kind of look at show tanks as basically a black box, and I'm interested in everything except the stuff that goes in that box. Go figure. However, the nice thing about seeing some show tanks is occasionally you see a particular coral that's just thriving like crazy in a way that yours simply do not. And at that point, I've got a lot of questions to see how we could be doing things better. There are a bunch of different show tanks here, but the one that I gravitated towards is this soft coral tank. In particular, the clove polyps in this tank are so fluffy and amazing. Ours tend to look tight and, I don't know, scraggly. I think there's a few things that could help ours out a lot, though. The first thing is to never use GFO or any iron-based phosphate remover. I've been down on the use of GFO for ages now, but apparently it strips out something that soft corals like. Not really sure if it's just a combination of trace elements or larger molecules, but long story short, no GFO. Second is elevated alkalinity. This is kind of non-intuitive because you would think soft corals would not really be using alkalinity, but multiple people on this trip had mentioned that their soft corals did much better in higher alkalinity environments. If we were ever to make a dedicated soft coral system, that is likely something that I would play with. The third and final thing about this soft coral tank is all flow related. They're providing this tank with quite a lot of flow, including a Tunzi wave box for this back and forth motion. It's been years since we've used a wave box, but I still have them, and it is something that we can try out to see if it'll stimulate better health. I think that we're probably going to use it on one of the smaller aquariums in the greenhouse and just see how that goes and put in a lot of this type of soft coral. Moving down the road from AAC, the only other shop that I visited was my friend Laura Carlin's wholesale facility called EcoMarines. I met Laura a long time ago, and really all of my UK connections today I can credit to her for reaching out all those years ago. She wanted some consulting on her coral farm slash wholesale business, and we did that for a little while, and eventually we just became friends. And now I would say that a lot of the information flow is very back and forth. Her facility is special because she runs this entire place by herself. You don't see too many one man band wholesalers, but here we are. It's actually mind boggling to think about, to be honest. There's a lot of tanks that need to be maintained, there's a lot of orders to be shipped out. It's a pretty big operation for one person to handle alone. Also, there's still room to grow. She's got more systems under construction. Now, what is inspiring about EcoMarines? One thing that Laura and I have in common is our appreciation of Goniopora. That's been a coral that both of us have been trying to get better at. And in the UK, she's developed quite the reputation for being like the Goni lady. We exchanged notes on it, but one of the major topics that we were discussing was feeding. At Tidal Gardens, we do some, but not a lot of direct feeding right now. But after this trip, it is something that I want to explore a lot more with our entire stock, not just Ghani's. For the purposes of this discussion, it's entirely possible that Goniopora simply need it in a way that other large polypstonies might not. Most of our corals grow pretty quickly. There are very few corals that we wish grew faster here. Usually, the corals are growing faster than we can sell them, but Goniopora are not on that list. We would definitely welcome faster growth and better survivability out of them. And if more aggressive feeding is the answer, we need to figure out exactly what that feeding regimen is going to look like. Another Goniopora husbandry topic that we discussed was water chemistry, specifically the importance of trace elements, and manganese chiefly above all the others. I think our manganese has been low for a long time, and I'm interested to see if Goniopora will perk up once we get that figure off of zero. My working theory for a lot of these trace elements is basically to get them off of zero. But historically, manganese has been one of those that has been difficult to get off of zero because it's consumed so quickly. So pretty much every ICP test that we send out is going to come back low, whether we're dosing it ourselves or not. After having this discussion, I think we're going to be bumping up our input of it. Moving on, like what we saw at AAC, EcoMarines goes hard on the live rock. They're using pallet-sized totes filled with the live rock on their invert systems, and likewise starting up new systems with basically wall-to-wall rock. Also, guys, aluminum stands, just saying. I will point out that in Laura's case, she did not get them pre-engineered and pre-cut into specific kits. She purchased the raw material and all the fittings and did the cutting of those lengths herself. This was actually a lifesaver because, weird story, she ordered some custom tanks. And there must have been some sort of mix up where the tanks that she received were not the correct size. Now, had she gotten those stands perfectly engineered, now she's kind of in a pickle, right? But because she had raw material length, she was able to modify the stands and make it all fit. Obviously, still a major annoyance, but salvageable. One last thing I noticed at EcoMarines was grafted chalice corals. She had one piece that was legit three different pieces of chalice that was all mixed in together. I think that's something worth exploring because we have several types of mycelium chalice just like this, and it would be an interesting project to see if we could just splice them up and mix them in this way. While most of my visit to the UK was in and around Essex, we did make several trips to London. One of the stops in London was the Horniman Museum. And if that name sounds familiar, that is the place where Jamie Craggs did all of that work on spawning Acropora. Jamie is a legend in the reef aquarium hobby ever since his Magna talk back in 2018. I remember that talk and just being blown away. The fact that he was able to do all of it was crazy at the time, but what really cinched it for me was when he showed these chimera acropora colonies that developed these ice cream swirl type patterns. The chimeras form from two fertilized eggs growing right next to each other and then combining into a single colony. Over the course of, I don't know, 30 plus years in the hobby, there are very few things that really move the needle. And Jamie's work in spawning was easily one of the most impactful things that I've ever seen. I think it's the future of the hobby, and I'm happy to see that more and more organizations are working on coral spawning today. We even got to see the spawning taking place. It is crazy that we can now predict spawning down to a window of a few hours, and we scheduled our visit to coincide with the spawning event. That is how precise it is now. A lot has to do with like feeding and light cycles, That just goes to show you also the robustness of modern lights these days, in particular Ecotech radions. I get it, radions get a lot of grief online, Mobius can be goofy as hell, but it is hard to argue with some of these results. This moonlight mode, we don't even use it at Tidal Gardens. We just, have them come on for like the majority of the day, no moonlights. Part of the rationale was back when I started, the moonlight feature on any of these LEDs was pretty dumb. I thought it was a dumb feature like disco mode or whatever the heck else, right? Turns out that the moonlight programming is about as real deal as it gets because they're able to predict spawning to super accurate windows of time. And yeah, that is one of the elements of this trip that I think that I might start to incorporate back at my farm. I may not be jumping right into coral spawning, but there's a whole bunch of other types of spawning that I'm very interested in. In particular, I want to get something going with sea urchin spawning. I've been in need of good herbivores. Whenever we order snails in from the wild that are decent herbivores, they always come with some weird issues. A whole bunch of them die. Sometimes you get like a poly-clad flatworm that basically masquerading as a snail and it goes out and snipes off more snails. There's a lot of issues that can come with like wild stuff in general. We're able to breed our own like trochus snails and breed our own urchins. Super interested. And so in Jamie's lab, they're doing a lot of work with tuxedo urchins, which happens to be my favorite kind of urchin. I think that's one project in the relative near term that I would like to explore. Having said all that, my biggest takeaway from this trip to the Horniman Museum was just how much Jamie was able to accomplish given the resources available. The Horniman is a very old institution, and the aquatic staff had to squeeze all of their research setups as best they could into tight hallways and behind the scenes. Their main job is to manage the displays. So all of this research and development stuff is all like back room side projects essentially. And the amount that they were able to accomplish is just wild. It's so tight back there that they jokingly have what's called like the Horniman Shuffle, where the staff has to scoot by one another in these tight corridors and stairwells and stuff like that, probably holding buckets of corals up and down. It's insane. It's inspired me to make room in my facility and do some of these types of spawning projects because my current excuse of not having enough space is a joke. Okay, guys, that pretty much does it for this portion of my little UK trip. Like I said, I came away with a whole bunch of different ideas worth exploring. So, in the comments below, what types of things inspire you in this hobby? Is it a podcast? Is it a trade show? Is it a YouTube channel? Is it a magazine? Seeing other people's home aquariums? Post it in the comments below. All right, guys. Until next time, happy reefing.